Hi, I'm Artis, and this is Art in a Changing World. So first we're going to draw a horizon line, and I'm using an HB pencil for this. Next I'm going to establish a vanishing point in the distance there, and I'm going to start putting in some of my hillside to establish the perspective as well. And I'm just making a few marks to kind of loosely place where I want those hills to come down to the river. And then I will work on the hillside in the background later. But these first two coming down here into the water will help establish that perspective. And I'm just paying some careful attention to the shapes of these hills. You don't have to be exact. It's not, no one's going to give you a test on it. You just want to get the character of the hills and paying attention a little bit to the height so that you get a nice sense of the perspective and the shapes that you see there. And later on, we'll add textures and values to, give it some more of the character of the place. Now I'm following along the line of the river and also paying attention to some of the topography at the edge of the river there too. One thing you'll notice is that I'm not drawing straight lines except for the horizon line, which I'm actually going to erase in places. I'm trying to make a line by scribbling rather than making any really hard lines so that the edge of the river has a softer transition. And so I'm doing lighter, sketchier kind of scribble lines, and then anytime I need to make that curve that's coming down toward that bottom right where the river will be coming down, I'm exaggerating the perspective a little bit. I'm just sort of doing it by a horizontal sort of scribble line to put in there. Right now I'm just putting in some of the character and the different shapes that I see in the rocks and the edge of this hill in the front. And you'll see here how I'm bringing that line down a little bit toward the bottom corner, and that just gives it an exaggerated sense of the perspective and draws the eye back, and then it also brings the viewer's eye into the piece on that bottom right in a more interesting way, I think, than just cutting it across. At this point, I'm establishing this tree in the foreground, and I'm going to do it in a really scribbly, loose way so that it keeps the sketchy character, but it still has that feeling of the tree here, this pine tree. It's really important with these scrubby pine trees to make things irregular, so try not to make them too symmetrical or too regular. Now I'm just shading in some of these rocks at the base of this tree where it's sort of growing out of a little bit of a crevice there, and then along the edge here where I see some rocks as well, and I'll kind of go throughout and look for some of those darker areas and fill in or scribble shade a little bit to establish some of that character in the rocks. This is a series of little plateaus that go up the hillside, and the more character I give, the more it will enhance the perspective and make the drawing that much more interesting. Now I'm going to establish this hill in the background that's lighter than everything else, and just to draw the eye back and put in that piece of the landscape. And I'm going to add some of the little details as I go, especially darkening the hillside as it comes forward so that you get a sense of contrast and difference in values, that grayscale. You want a difference in those values. Now I'm going to work on some of these trees along the ridge line there, and it's really just a scribbly kind of up and down line, and coming down I'll add a few more of them here and there, just enhancing the difference in those dark edges as well. Up here I'm just going to do a little bit of shading to vary the shapes, and then still keep drawing the eye back with a difference in values, and I mean by that light to dark ratio. Now I'm just going to erase the horizon line that's running through this hillside, and so that I can work on some of those details. I don't need that horizon line there for now, or anymore rather, and so now I'm just going to shade along the ridge line where these rocks sharpen and the contrast increases so that they come forward from the background. Just adding a little bit of character in some of these little stair steps that go in the rocks up this hillside. And I'm just shading along this hillside as well so that I get a little bit more darkness, a little more value, and again it gives a contrast, a greater contrast to the sky, and I'm still not trying to make it as dark as some of those rock edges that are further forward, so I'm always comparing my lights and darks. And just adding some of the character in that I see here. And I'm just going to continue adding more character as I bring these forms from the hillside further forward. There are some more overlapping hills here, and they kind of plateau at the top. So I'm just adding those in and adding some of the shading along the edge. And now I'm just adding a few of these darker areas along the water line and some little trees, just little vertical marks that are kind of dark that will stand out against that background, the lighter background. And then as I come forward, I'm just adding more small marks to give some of the character of the hillside, and I'll also add in some more trees coming up. And I'm just adding some more of these little peninsulas that stick out into the river. And the more you add those darker areas, the more it will enhance the perspective, especially if you get darker as you come forward. It really does bring the eye into the foreground a lot more. And then of course my shapes are getting a little bit larger, a little bit more distinct. So I'm just adding more shading and more marks as I come forward. And right now I'm just continuing with my mark making and enhancing, all of those little marks to just adding more, adding little tree lines, kind of vertical scribbles as well. And it breaks up the line of the hills, and it does give the illusion that there's some trees there sticking up. Right down here I'm going to scribble a bit more, go a little bit darker on this peninsula, and I'm doing a sort of wider, looser scribble to kind of fill this area in and make it look like there's a bit more tree there, clusters of trees. The same down here, I'm going to add some more clusters of trees, just making them smaller. And now I'm just moving around and adding more clusters of trees throughout so that you get that illusion that there's some trees kind of all over this hillside. And again, these are just small either dots or vertical marks that I'm making that are pretty dark, and the more you add in those areas, the more character you'll have. Along this peninsula of rock, it's important to make things pretty dark so that they stand out against that bit of water that's behind. And right now it's just the white of the paper. But if I darken this area and really give it some character, it will give it that illusion of being a little bit of a further forward kind of shoreline. The same here with this peninsula. It's much darker as it comes forward, and I want to make sure that I give it plenty of character along the edge. I'm going to add in more trees now, these scribbly short trees, but they're larger than the ones I had in the background. Again, keep them irregular. You want to make them different heights, different widths, different shapes, and make sure you go shorter as they go further away and taller as they come forward into the foreground. And then just shade, really darkening some areas, especially as you come further forward, is going to give you a lot more dimension. And getting some overlapping in. So these are those oak trees that are kind of scrubby in the bottom left corner there, and there's a few along this edge. And I want to add enough of that in that it loosens up the edge a little bit, breaks up that edge, and gives you some overlapping so you're looking past them to that distant point. And now I'm going to draw out the island here in the Columbia. This is one of the islands known as a Memaloose, which is a Chinook word meaning to die. It's a derivation of the Chinook word. And they were important burial places for Native Americans in the area. And so I want to make this have some dimension and be an important part of the landscape here. So I'm just going to make it kind of a lumpy shape to begin with, and then I'm going to darken it and try to get some of the character so that it stands out from the surroundings. And then I'm going to overlap it with some trees so that it softens the effect of it and kind of situates it better into the river and landscape. Now I'm going to do some shading very lightly in the water so that I get a little bit more interest here, and it also helps direct the eye back into the distance there. It's also, such a stark contrast if you don't do any shading. So you want to keep your marks rather kind of horizontal so that they don't distort the perspective, and then you can vary the values. So make some areas a little darker, some areas a little lighter, and then making the marks a little kind of longer or a little more distinct in the foreground and a little lighter and looser as they go away. And now I want to darken this edge a little bit and add a little more character of these rocks here in the foreground, and it will bring the viewer's eye in nicely, but it will also give a little bit more interest there. So you want to make sure that's dark enough that it really does keep the eye forward. I'm also adding some of the grasses and just doing some shading along that edge before adding some of the loose kind of leaves through mark making on these these sort of scrub oaks here as well. So for those, you just want to be really, really loose. Make lots of little marks. You can kind of swirl them and make little dots and just spend a little time going over that area. And now I'm going to exaggerate things a little and add this tree trunk all the way down to the bottom there. It's this pine tree, but I want to do that to really give a strong sense of overlapping and perspective. So I'm adding the pine tree in, making it a little larger, a little bit more important here in the foreground, a greater sense of overlapping, and it'll enhance that sense of depth and perspective. And it also really obstructs that side of the island just a little bit. It gives it that an even greater sense of depth as well. Again, keep it irregular, make it really loose, but you do need to darken it enough that it has a really good sense of overlapping. And I'm just going to add more of these rocks, right here in the foreground, make them nice and dark as I go. I could switch to a softer pencil at this point too, but I'm having fun just kind of working with my HB pencil. But if you wanted it to have a really dramatic shift, you could switch to like an 8B, a softer pencil, and it would give you an even darker mark. More oak trees, just keep making marks and it'll fill in that area and soften everything up a little bit nicely. I'm going to make sure that you shade at the base of these as well. So I'm just adding some of the finishing details, a little bit more contrast at this back edge here, at the top edge, a little more tree line, a few more random marks to add a little more interest to my hillside, and moving around and keep it loose. And I'm choosing not to do anything more with the sky, so I have a nice contrast. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you next time.